Shakespeare bought his way into the upper class.
We're the same way in our culture. If you have enough money, all kinds of things that look like they're only based on principle or meritocracy can come your way.
That the good type of social mobility is return.
Exactly.
It's not you exceed your station, it's you go back to your station.
How to get a large crowd to cry, to scream, to laugh, to love you, to hate you. Shakespeare thought that there was something extremely dangerous and dark about the theater.
In Shakespeare's time, the player was a lowly person playing a high status person. Today, the actor is a high status person playing often a low status person.
If you have that character called Iago, he says, indeed? And with that one word manages to take apart someone's life. You will remember that for the rest of your life. One of my most life-changing experiences was reading Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals and being completely knocked over by it. I couldn't believe it. I hated it, but I was completely flabbergasted by it. And I never lost the feeling that my life has been changed by reading this wretched book.
We like to imagine great artists as being indifferent to worldly prestige, that they are somehow above fawning over status symbols. And yet the greatest playwright of all time was obsessed with getting himself into the upper class. Shakespeare spent an exorbitant amount of money that he could have spent on his parents, his wife, his children, his craft, on buying a coat of arms to become a gentleman. He literally bought his way into the upper class. My guest today is one of the greatest Shakespeare scholars, Stephen Greenblatt, and he's going to help us make sense of Shakespeare's social ambition. Is Shakespeare a hypocrite for displaying the very social pretensions he mocks in his plays? And how did Shakespeare think about his craft? Was it entertainment? Was it a vehicle for profit? Or was there some higher goal? Working through Shakespeare's motivations were so valuable because I recognized them in myself. But even stronger, it was uncanny reading how similar his parents' situation were to mine. His father's upwards trajectory was cut short by financial setbacks when he was a young boy. And when I was around the same age, my father's was as well by 2008. His mother is from a once noble lineage that had fallen into obscurity, and so is my mother, from a great house of an empire that had ceased to exist. I found in Shakespeare the same desire to restore my family's legacy. And so I was almost moved to tears when I read Professor Greenblatt's dramatization of what Shakespeare must have been thinking when he got that coat of arms. I, Shakespeare, am not someone who can be treated like a hired servant or whipped like a vagabond. I am someone who does not merely pretend on stage to be a gentleman. I am a true gentleman, entitled to bear arms both by virtue of my father's distinguished service and by virtue of my mother's distinguished family. I have, with the fruits of my labor and my imagination, returned my family to the moment before things began to fall apart. I have affirmed the distinction of my mother's name and restored my father's honor. I have laid claim to my lost inheritance. I have created that inheritance. So my favorite story in your Shakespeare biography has to be how he bought his way into the upper class. So let me give a rough background and context for our listeners. So Shakespeare was born in 1564 to John Shakespeare, right? His dad was a glover, and to Mary Arden. Now, Arden was this prestigious, noble family, but Mary Arden was part of a branch that had fallen from grace, so to speak. So Shakespeare grew up not as a gentleman status, as a commoner. However, he was on an upward trajectory. So his father was doing very well in his business. He was an alderman. He was a public man of service. Shakespeare had been trained in grammar school and Latin, and it was expecting to go to university. And in his teenage years, his dad put in an application for a coat of arms that would effectively make the Shakespeare family into gentlemen. Now, unfortunately, financial tragedies hit. They weren't able to complete that coat of arms application. And it was almost 10 plus years later that Shakespeare himself purchased that coat of arms and turned himself and his descendants into gentlemen. And I love that story because it's comforting in some way, because I recognized my desire for vanity and social prestige. You know, you tend to think of that as a base desire, but it's almost comforting to realize that one of the great geniuses of the world also spent so much of his attention and time fixated on social advancement. And so it not only humanizes Shakespeare, also makes me feel a bit better about myself.
It's interesting, Jonathan. I mean, we now, I think because of probably of Romanticism and its aftermath, tend to think of the great artists as bohemians, indifferent to social status. And indeed, many of Shakespeare's contemporaries were either bohemians, or more likely they were, if they had been born into a reasonably comfortable circumstance, they were on the way down by virtue of being playwrights. But as you say, Shakespeare seems to have moved in the opposite direction. It's not perhaps quite as, how should we say, comforting or innocent as it sounds, only because the distinction between who was a gentleman and who was not a gentleman meant a hell of a lot more in the late 16th century. It's one I can understand, truthfully. My grandfather, who came to America from Lithuania in the late 1880s or very early 90s, it's hard to describe it as a profession. He was what was called a rag picker. That's the absolute lowest point you can get without simply starving to death. It meant he went around picking up stuff on the street and trying to resell it. And my father became a lawyer. That was the sort of classic, in a way, American pattern of from one generation to another, of starting at the bottom and then reaching out. And when I was an undergraduate, when I asked my father what my grandfather, whom I didn't know, did, he said, he had a horse and wagon. He wasn't hiding anything. He had a horse and wagon, would go around. But when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I remember sitting in a little carrel in the library, with a little desk with books in front of me, and I saw there was something called the Boston Register for 1890 or whatever it was, that had a list of citizens of the city of Boston and by profession. So I looked up Morris Greenblatt, my grandfather, and that was the first moment in which I saw the word rag picker. So that was a gigantic jump. Me sitting in the library at Yale, super fancy WASP University, and this very, very close, I mean, only two generations before, this person at the bottom of the barrel. That's as close probably as we're going to get to the absolutely extreme difference. If you were a gentleman in this period, if you were counted as a gentleman, if you were armigerous, as they called it, which meant that you had a coat of arms to your name, you were entitled to be treated with respect. It meant that people were expected to take their hats off to you, to stand up when you came in the room. All kinds of treatment of that kind.
Right. Executions were different between the gentlemen.
Executions, that's a different matter. Even executions, but that's a literacy question. It meant, had you gone to school and had you learned Latin? They kept the medieval rule that said that if you were a priest, you were entitled to be tried in the ecclesiastical court and not in the civil court for a serious crime. And it happened that in the ecclesiastical court, there was no death penalty. But in the civil courts, there were death penalties. So if you could somehow prove that you were a priest, a cleric, you could be tried in the ecclesiastical court, and you wouldn't be hanged, quartered, disemboweled. And that was the distinction. And the way you proved it was to read a sentence in Latin.
Right, I see. Now, what's extraordinary, given this large stratification, as you described, is the fact that you could jump from commoner to gentleman status. And not only that, the even more surprising thing was that there was an institution, the College of Heralds, that actually systematically help people go from commoner to gentleman. So tell us about how one became from commoner to gentleman.
Well, Jonathan, you say it systematically helped people to go, but it also systematically tried to prevent people from going from commoner to gentleman. That is to say, it tried to keep track of the...
Right. This is the registry.
To weigh the legitimacy of the claim that someone was making. The easiest way to move from commoner to gentleman was to get a degree from university. That was the key element. If you could go to university and get a degree, a Bachelor of Arts degree, you could be counted as a gentleman. So Shakespeare's exact contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, was born the same year, 1564, and was in a provincial town, Canterbury in Marlowe's case, Stratford in Shakespeare's. Marlowe's father was a cobbler. The family was illiterate. Marlowe miraculously, mysteriously managed to get into a very good grammar school. And then Marlowe got a scholarship to go to university. Right. And Marlowe graduated from Cambridge University. And when Marlowe's works were printed, they were printed as by Christopher Marlowe, gentleman. Now, that was a very important distinction. Right. When Christopher Marlowe was arrested in 1591 on charges of counterfeiting, which was a capital offense, he was abroad in an English military outpost. He was arrested. He identified himself as Christopher Marlowe, a scholar and gentleman, and he was sent back. Instead of being hanged from the nearest tree, he was sent back to England, and he was let go. And that, I mean, that's the seriousness of this distinction we're talking about. So it is, of course, exactly as you say, social ambition on Shakespeare's part. So ambition he made fun of in his own plays. Right. But it's also a very important distinction in the society. Right.
And not only did Shakespeare make fun of Shakespeare, everyone else, it seemed like, also made fun of Shakespeare. This is my favorite quote in your entire book. Will himself wrote a motto to accompany the shield and crest, right, which is his coat of arms. Non sans droit, Old French for not without right. Half defiant, half defensive. The clerk who wrote down the words on the draft of the grant of arms made a telling mistake, either unconsciously or with sly sarcasm. Non, comma, sans droit. The comma, in effect, turns the motto into an official rejection. No, without justification. Yeah. In a later play, one of Shakespeare's colleagues, Ben Jonson, has a rustic buffoon named Sogliardo pay £30 for a ridiculous coat of arms, to which an acquaintance mockingly proposes the humiliating motto, not without mustard.
Must have been very uncomfortable for Shakespeare. Right. We happen to have a very strong supposition that Shakespeare was performing in that play. So Shakespeare would have been on stage.
You had to hear it, right.
While he was, how should we say, being shat on by his colleague and frenemy, Jonson.
Right. So Shakespeare, unfortunately, did not go to university because of his father's financial troubles. How does someone without a university degree go to the College of Heralds?
The simple answer is money. Shakespeare was, by his later 20s, making a lot of money as not simply as an actor, but as a playwright. And he used it somewhat oddly, because he had a wife and 3 children back home. He used it to pay the College of Heralds to carry on the application that had been started, as you say, a decade before by his father.
So is that a bribe or like?
Not exactly a bribe, but they made it. I mean, the reason it's like a lot of, we laugh at the system as we laugh at the neck verse business and so forth. We're the same way in our culture. If you have enough money, you can all kinds of things that look like they're only based on principle or meritocracy can come your way. Right. So, and it's set up without anyone acknowledging that it's set up that way. So if you have enough money to pay for the various official papers to be drawn up, the pictures to be drawn, the people to be paid for their services, you can get the system underway. It wasn't that he was bribing anyone. Right. And even then, after he got the coat of arms, there was competition among in the College of Heralds, and another herald complained that someone called Shakespeare the player, Shakespeare ye player, who should never have got a coat of arms. And that's because being a player, an actor, was like being a rag picker. I mean, it was at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. So one last question here. My understanding was that the party line, so to speak, of gentleman and commoner was a difference in nature or kind. So does the College of Herald have to fabricate a genealogy for Shakespeare? Oh, I'm going to trace you into this magistrate or something. Is that what they do when they are paid money?
Yes, they did fabricate something of a genealogy, or rather they believed how should we say, romanticized account that Shakespeare gave of his background, of the background that went back through so-and-so and so-and-so. Somewhere halfway between fabrication and enhancement, let's say, of what looked, and besides, this is a world in which who the hell knows who your ancestors were. So it's anyone's guess. So you can make up a certain amount, even in a record-keeping society like Shakespeare's.
Right. There's another telling part, I think, about Shakespeare's life that really showed his social ambition, and that was the choosing of the profession itself. As you described in your book, the player, because plays at the time were mostly about the aristocracy, was literally about a low-class person, a commoner, playing a gentleman. Yes. So the profession itself had this telos of imitating the upper classes. And one of the other stratification that you didn't mention, but I think is significant, is that as a player, you can wear the noble's clothes only on stage, because out in society, even that was regulated. So here's my question for you, Professor, which is, in Shakespeare's time, the player was a lowly person playing a high status person. Today, the actor is a high status person playing often a low status person. That's what movie is about. What happened?
It is interesting. I mean, it's not about players being insignificant in Shakespeare's time.
They were famous, right?
Yeah, Shakespeare's great actor contemporaries, Richard Burbage or Edward Allen, they were famous and they actually made a lot of money. And when Shakespeare dies, practically nobody seems to notice. When Richard Burbage dies, everyone notices. I mean, it's a big deal. So it's not because the actors weren't famous. It's because being an actor was regarded as tainted or not exactly like being a prostitute, but getting down there because you had to act in front of a bunch of plebeians. I mean, chewing garlic and shouting from the pit. And that seemed completely inappropriate. Now, I'll go back to your question of clothing. Now, the clothing that we wear is, at least for the middle classes in America, equalizing. I wear roughly the same kind of clothing that Elon Musk wears. Someone who's about to get whatever it is, $55 billion pay packet, and I can assure you that's not my pay packet, that we're basically dressed to look alike. And that's because really of a radical social change in not just in the United States, but basically in Western countries in general, which was a kind of erasure of the official markers of social difference. We of course have huge amounts of social difference, but it's much more hidden.
Right.
And in Shakespeare's society, there are rules governing what anyone can wear. Of course, the reason there are rules is people are violating the rules all the time. Otherwise, they wouldn't write the rules down. So they're trying to keep control of this, but they're always about to lose control. But it's absolutely the case that the actors dressed up in clothing that they were, at least by law, officially not allowed to wear once they left the theater.
I see. So one of the core theses of your book, or at least your method, is to look at Shakespeare's life and then see how his life connects with his work. And so now that we've talked about how Shakespeare exhibited social ambition in the profession that he chose in his very application for the coat of arms, let's talk about social ambition in Shakespeare's plays, right? And maybe we can first talk about this desire for vanity, recognition, glory. Obviously, in Shakespeare's plays, often this drive leads people astray, right? So I'm preparing a lecture on Caesar, as I told you, and it's clear that Caesar is being driven astray by his desire to. He talks about himself in the third person, right? I'm immovable like the North Star, right before he gets killed. Brutus is almost playing the part of a Stoic, and Cassius, the first thing after he kills Caesar, is he meditates on his act and he says, how many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted in states unborn and accents yet unknown? That's not what you should be thinking, right? After you stage a coup, it should be about how to get political power, not the glory you're gonna get. Clearly, vanity can lead so many of Shakespeare's characters astray. Does Shakespeare give any positive role models about how the desire for honor, for glory, for recognition can be harmonized for the community and the individual?
I want to come back to this question, but I'm going to get there in a slightly roundabout way, Jonathan, by saying that the closest that Shakespeare comes to what we've been talking about of how someone from a lower social class rises to a remarkable position happens in a play like Twelfth Night, where after a shipwreck, Viola becomes an assistant, a servant for the great Duke Orsino, and by the end of the play marries Duke Orsino. Or in a late play of Shakespeare's, Cymbeline, two boys who've grown up in a cave wind up basically becoming the heirs to the kingdom. But the trick of those is that Shakespeare uses a device, an ancient device from what was called the Romance. It turns out that Viola really is a noblewoman, and the boys who were brought up in a cave were actually the kidnapped sons of the king. They're of royal blood. So Shakespeare is very careful to be actually, in those plots, totally conservative.
Right.
That is to say, the people who go from rags to riches, or more accurately in terms of our conversation,
riches to rags to riches.
The people who go from low social class to high social class turn out to be from high social class to begin with. Right. Like The Prince and the Pauper, those stories where they turn out actually to be, all along, to be noble. Now, to go back to where you started in Julius Caesar, that's a different matter. That's not about rising in social class. Brutus and Cassius and Caesar are already from the elite in ancient Rome. They're the equivalent to the Elizabethan upper class. So that's not the issue. The issue is whether one of them is going to rise above the other, and whether Caesar can take the next step up way beyond what looks like his Republican fellows, Brutus, Cassius, Pompey, and the rest of it. And that's unacceptable. And they're in a rage at that. One shouldn't rise above the others. Ambition of that kind, profound desire for power, not for social class in this case, but for power, preeminence. That is something that Shakespeare routinely marks as extremely dangerous. We could say that the immediate social context for that is not what we're talking about, how the lower classes could possibly rise into the middle class or upper class. It's about factionalism, because the Elizabethan court and Elizabethan society in general was riven by factions.
Right.
Queen Elizabeth, she's in a very tricky situation. She's a woman in a deeply misogynistic culture.
Right.
She's very smart and very determined to hold on to her power. And what she does is to play one faction off against another of these very powerful macho men around her, so that the faction around William Burleigh is basically jockeying for position against the faction around the Earl of Leicester. The faction around the Earl of Leicester is fighting with Raleigh's faction. Raleigh's faction is fighting with Essex's faction. And she works this brilliantly. And the trick would be if one of those threatens to rise
to prominence
above the other. And they're constantly watching each other. They're watching the Queen, of course, as well, but the system is stable as long as one of them doesn't lift up way above the other.
Right,
and Shakespeare is terrifically sensitive to that. So nonetheless, your question is, can Shakespeare ever think that trying to achieve what in the ancient world in Greece was called kleos, preeminence, glory, the kind of thing that in Homer they're always trying to, the great warriors are always trying to get, is that something that Shakespeare can acknowledge and honor? And the answer is yes, but always with a sense that how risky it is. And the way he basically most of all honors it is through the character of Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V. But notice that Prince Hal, Shakespeare's vision of Hal, in a series of plays, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and then Henry V. Hal starts as the son, Prince of Wales, the son and heir of the king, descends into the tavern world and is a delinquent.
Right.
And then only after he's gone all the way down to the bottom does he rise again, and then rise even further to the height of the great victor at Agincourt.
And this goes back to the shape of what you were talking about initially, which is that it's a return. That the good type of social mobility is return. Exactly. It's not you exceed your station, it's you go back to your station. And I think we can see how in Shakespeare's life, this idea of loss and recovery is a key theme that bled into his works, right? Because first of all, his dad, from his paternal side, it's loss and recovery because his dad was on this upward trajectory. It was cut short, and then Shakespeare was sort of reestablishing that. But there's also a maternal view where he's reestablishing the Arden line, right? And so this idea of loss and recovery is the topic of your new book called Second Chances.
Yes.
So tell us about this new book.
Yes, I began by thinking about the certain oddity in my own life. I taught the first half of my career at the University of California at Berkeley. I taught the second half of my career at Harvard. I moved from California, where I spent the first half of my career, to back to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I had one family, and then in the wake of a divorce, a second family. I began to think how funny it feels like I've had two different lives. And it was marked for me by the fact that my friends back in Berkeley call me Steve. And my friends at Harvard all call me Stephen. I didn't ask for anyone to change my name. They just did. And it was as if kind of mysteriously it marked that I had two different lives. And then I began to think, because this is the way my mind works, I always try to think these things through Shakespeare. I began to think, what does Shakespeare think about whether you could have two lives or a second chance in life? It turns out that Shakespeare was obsessed with second chances, with the possibility of a second chance. Most obviously toward the end of his life, in the way that I describe myself, because the late plays, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, Pericles, Cymbeline, they're explicitly about people having second chances in life, loss and recovery, disaster and recuperation, getting something back that you think you've lost forever. And the great version of that is the late romance play called The Winter's Tale. But it turns out that that pattern is all over the place in Shakespeare. And I began to think, oh my goodness, this is a kind of very peculiar, Germans would say, leitmotif. And so I began to think about it psychologically, and I happened at the same time to read a book by a British psychoanalyst friend of mine named Adam Phillips. So I said, let's write a book together, one about Shakespeare and Freud, because I began to think about the ways in which Freud too is just fascinated by the question of whether if you're down in a disastrous place, whether you can come back and have a second chance. So we've written a two-pronged book, my half of which is about Shakespeare, his half about Freud, speaking to each other.
I want to dig into what sentence you said. You said, as my mind works, I started to think about this through Shakespeare. So my training was in philosophy, and philosophy purports to be the art of living, right? It's supposed to teach you how to live in a very direct and explicit and systematic way. Do you think thinking through Shakespeare, through literature, is almost an even more effective means to achieve that goal of art of living?
I suppose what you're describing, Jonathan, is an old argument between philosophy and literature, or at least a disagreement about where you would most find guidance in your life. And some of it is temperamental. There are people who find that guidance, as it were, in life principally from philosophy, if you happen to get hit by it, and people who are principally hit from literature. And it a little bit depends on whether you need your philosophy, how shall we say, in a situated form, in a plot, in a set of characters, in a life situation. Having said that, one of my most life-changing experiences was reading Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals when I was in high school, and being completely knocked over by it. I couldn't believe it. I hated it, but I was completely flabbergasted by it, and I never lost the feeling that my life has been changed by reading this wretched book. So it's not just literature that can do it to me. There are certain works in philosophy as well. But that said, particularly at the end of many decades spending my life thinking about literature and about Shakespeare, I tend to process much of my experience, ordinary experience, through literature and through Shakespeare particularly. The other day, this spring, my wife and I went to the Arnold Arboretum. We went there during the lilac season. It's a traditional thing to do around here, when all the lilacs bloom at the same time. And there's an extraordinary, unbelievably delicious smell of the lilacs that wafts down from the walk in which the lilacs are all blooming. And as I walked down there, I felt myself thinking about lines from Twelfth Night, about the wind stealing odors and giving them to you. Shakespeare has marvelous lines about the way in which the wind picks up delicious smells and carries them from one place to another. I mean, this is a professional deformation, as if I couldn't entirely experience even the deliciousness of the
without
lilacs,
thinking about Shakespeare,
without not actively thinking about, without processing it through that.
Right.
Thing.
But I want to highlight perhaps a reason why that this happens, and it's exactly what you said. Do you want your philosophy in abstract systematic form or in situational form, in a plot, in a person? And that, I think, also ties into Shakespeare's life, because one of the popular genres of play when Shakespeare was a kid that he must have watched were called morality plays. And what Shakespeare changed about morality plays, that you said in your book, is that in morality plays, there is an abstract character, like vice, or lethargy. And it's just a character called lethargy who embodies that value. But of course, in Shakespeare, there is no abstract character other than maybe Father Time, right, once in a while. And so the idea is that, Falstaff is better than drunkenness, right? Than this abstract notion of drunkenness. So it's the embodiedness of literature and of Shakespeare in particular that makes it perhaps go down smoother, so to speak.
Or have a kind of way of gripping you. At least that was what I think Shakespeare discovered. Though you'll correct me or you'll remind me, there's a movie on now. It has a set of abstract parts of a
Inside Out, right? That's the cartoon.
Inside Out 2 is just started. That's just early 16th century morality play.
Right.
That's exactly how those were structured. So it shows you there's still life from that old form.
Right.
It's just that you can have a marvelous character called envy. You can have that character have a kind of energy to it. But if you have that character called Iago, and he says, indeed, when someone says something that, and with that one word manages to take apart someone's life, you will remember that for the rest of your life.
Right, I see. Okay, so unfortunately we're running a bit short on time. What I want to talk about now is motivation. In your book, you sprinkled many different types of motivation that Shakespeare had. One is obviously social ambition. Obviously, there's the drive for money. There's pure entertainment. But there were two drives that I felt was conspicuously absent. The first drive is a desire to significantly contribute, to make a positive impact on the world. I quote to you your book. To the extent that Shakespeare explicitly articulates a goal, and he generally seems very reluctant to do so, it is simply to give his audience the repeated experience of pleasure. The clown at the end of Twelfth Night sings, "But that's all one, our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day." Near the end of his career, in the figure of the magician Prospero, Shakespeare seems to articulate a far grander vision for the artist. "Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, opt and let 'em forth, by my so potent art." But the character immediately repudiates this vision. "Deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book." And in the play's epilogue, appealing for applause, he returns to the clown's modest goal. "Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails," which was to please. How could Shakespeare have such a limited view on the power of literature?
I'm not sure he had a limited view, Jonathan. I think, first of all, he had a genre-driven view. And the sonnets, he's perfectly capable of saying in his sonnets that these sonnets are going to last longer than marble tombs. This is going to eternize you. In my verses, you'll live forever. So the sonnets make the most extravagant and grandiose claims for the power of Shakespeare's art. But they're the sonnets, they're poems. So Shakespeare understood plays, standing up before 2,000 people, having your actors stand up and perform in grease paint and borrowed costumes, as a completely different enterprise.
Fleeting, temporary.
Writing from writing poems, in which it would be inappropriate to say, my plays are going to last forever. Everyone would, I think he would have laughed. I think everyone would have laughed.
But they are going to last forever.
They are going to last forever. And in fact, Shakespeare's contemporary, Johnson, the same one who said not without mustard, compared Shakespeare to Aeschylus and Sophocles. Right. So that is to say, so it was possible to imagine this, but Shakespeare doesn't. So come back to your question, why not? Why would he make such a claim in poetry, but not make such a claim for theater? And in addition to a certain kind of, how should we say, graciousness, maybe modesty, maybe false modesty, humility, what used to be called the humility topos, you pretend to be more humble than you are. But there's something else, I think. We'll come back to Julius Caesar perhaps for a moment. Shakespeare thought that there was something extremely dangerous and dark about the theater. It's not an accident. Of course, the Prospero in The Tempest is in the passage that you quote, graves of oak. That's necromancy. That was a terrifying, demonic offense, necromancy. Waking dead up and speaking to them. That's a complete no-no in Shakespeare's world. And it's not an accident that Antony in Julius Caesar is the master of a kind of theatrical performance. And it's not an accident that Iago in Othello is a kind of brilliant manipulator, playwright manipulator.
It's suspicious.
So I think that Shakespeare thought that in his art, and I said it relates to contemporary situation, our contemporary situation, I think Shakespeare thought that a certain kind of manipulation of a large crowd, how to get a large crowd to cry, to scream, to laugh, to love you, to hate you, that was an extremely dangerous quality, and one that you wouldn't associate with the highest or unequivocally moral object of a human being.
Right, I see. So he did have, in this mid-career, I think in his late 20s, a sonnet writing period of a few years, but then he went back to plays. So in Shakespeare's mind, obviously today we read him more for his plays than for his sonnets, but in Shakespeare's mind, was he giving up the more ambitious goal and he was almost content just being a temporal entertainer?
Shakespeare, first of all, he probably wrote sonnets over a longer period of time. Right. He wrote a few his great long poems over a fairly short period of time, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. And it's also the case that in his own time, among the elite, Shakespeare was at least as famous for being a poet. All people your age would have had verses from Venus and Adonis by heart. I mean, that was where kids who were in college or just out of college, that's where their heads were. It wasn't in the plays. That said, Shakespeare saw his central magical powers as powers in the theater. And that's why he ends or comes near the end of his career with Prospero the magician. I think Shakespeare got it, that he was a very great poet, but that his greatest gifts were the gifts of plotting and impersonation, the gifts of being a great, great playwright, where he used his poetic gifts, his poetic skills, but in creating plays. And I think that Shakespeare didn't, how should we say, underestimate his stupendous power as his genius as a playwright. I think he knew perfectly well that's what he had.
Right. That also answers the second motivation. I said there was two motivations that I found was absent. One was helping the world, and the other is immortal glory. But that also to answer that question, that it was through his sonnets that he felt he was going to achieve immortal glory. I want to ask one last question, and it has to do with what you said about he was suspicious of the theater. And also, as we discussed today, he also had a desire for social mobility. But I quote to you your book. Shakespeare was a master of double consciousness. He was a man who spent his money on a coat of arms, but who mocked the pretentiousness of such a claim. A man who invested in real estate, but who ridiculed in Hamlet precisely such an entrepreneur as he himself was. A man who spent his life and his deepest energies on the theater, but who laughed at the theater and regretted making himself a show. What do we make of this, as you call it, I think quite charitably, double consciousness? Is it to be praised as the ability to see all sides? Is it to be derided as hypocrisy? Or is it to be seen as perhaps just human weakness? You know, we all know that we shouldn't desire glory, but we can't help ourselves.
I would have said, Jonathan, that it's a particular glory of Shakespeare's mind and sensibility, consciousness, and gift. I think I see perfectly well that from a certain kind of philosopher's point of view, let's say the point of view of Socrates, who ridicules the fact that people could have two what appear to be contradictory ideas in their head at the same time. And that is fundamentally Plato's argument against literature, that it doesn't know what it's talking about. It's radically inconsistent.
It's non-committal, right?
Or that it's contradictory.
Right.
It thinks two opposite things at the same time. But thinking two opposite things at the same time is, from Shakespeare's perspective, and I have to say from my perspective, closer to the truth of human experience than the pretended consistencies of a perfectly coherent philosophical point of view.
So the answer is that human nature itself is inconsistent.
Yes.
And therefore, to portray it accurately, that's how you have to portray it. And so you don't read it as hypocritical, that he would mock the social ambition and then be social ambitious himself.
I don't think Shakespeare is a deeply religious writer, self-consciously, but I think Christianity is a profound lesson in what I'm calling double consciousness. It has to do with being a god and a man at the same time, being mortal and vulnerable, and being supreme and invulnerable at the same time, being a human being and being the Son of God. And that is to say, I think Shakespeare inherited 1500 or 1600 year tradition of thinking about how it's possible to be two impossible things together.
Right.
And I think that deeply influenced his way of creating his world.
I see where you're coming from, but let me push you one last way, which is, let's say I write a novel about emancipation of slaves, and it clearly had a political aim, and it showed different sides of why some people are slave owners, but it was clearly an emancipatory novel, and that I own slaves in my own life. You wouldn't give me a pass, right? You wouldn't say that, oh, well, this is literature, this is double consciousness, this is man and God, right?
I mean, it depends what you mean by give me a pass. We are the descendants, the inheritors of a political system created by Thomas Jefferson. And you've just described Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
The question is, what do we do with that inheritance? I'm not saying that everything that Shakespeare believed a very long time ago is exactly what we should believe, that every one of those positions, if that's what you mean by give you a pass. But I do think that not only with the principle of forgiveness and tolerance, but simply with the principle of where we come from, and a beginning at least of an acceptance of how contradictory our own lives are, we might begin to try to process what it means to have these complications in our position.
I see. Thank you, Professor. Thanks for a fascinating interview.
You're entirely welcome.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. If you like this interview, there's two more that I filmed with Professor Greenblatt on Shakespeare's life and thought. One of the interviews investigates why there are no good marriages in Shakespeare, despite there being so many instances of passionate courtship. And the other one is about Shakespeare's genius. So that's the theatrical environment that he wrote in, where he found his inspiration, and what ultimately makes him one of the greats. Now, another direction you can go is to actually explore one of Shakespeare's plays. Personally, Julius Caesar is my favorite. It's about a world historic event with captivating protagonists and shocking relevance to our political moment today. If that interests you, then check out my lecture on Shakespeare's Caesar. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.